Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm really grateful to introduce Fred Schoenagel from NRCS. He's a resource soil scientist working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Natural Resource Conservation Service. He's been employed by the USDA and NRCS for 26 years, where he's mapped and inventoried soils for the Soil Survey Division and currently interprets soil for many different purposes related to natural resource conservation. He has a bachelor's degree in agronomy and a master's degree in soil scientist, both from Penn State University. Um, we're super grateful to Fred. He came to our the Food Shed Alliance field day that we had back in August at the Sage Farm, and I learned so much about soil in such a short time. So I thank you all for joining us tonight. I know, you know, we can get as far into soil as we can on a webinar, and I trust Fred has a great presentation ready for us. So take it away, Fred. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tess. Thanks everybody for joining us. It's a real privilege. Always like doing, I really like doing field type trainings, but I understand webinars and presentations done virtually are important too. So I appreciate the opportunity. So thanks, Tess, and New Jersey Food Shed Alliance. So as Tess said, I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I didn't know what to title this talk, so I titled it Evaluating Soils and Sites, which isn't very exciting, but hopefully some of the information will be usable and helpful. So this is basically what I do for my job, evaluating soils for different purposes. So we're basically, you get to see a little bit of what I do while I sort of try to help everybody understand a little bit more about the soil that they work with. So let's jump right into it. So I'm a soil scientist, and pretty much every soils presentation you ever see me do, I like to bring up the functions of soil. So the reason we bring these up, it's a reason why we conserve soil, protect soil, and why I have to study soil and evaluate it, because soils provide all of these different functions. I'm not going to read them, but you can sort of go through them. One thing I like to point out about, or a couple of things I like to point about these functions, every soil possibly has the possibility of being able to carry out every one of these functions, but some soils are actually only able to carry out one or two of these functions. It doesn't make the soil bad or good. It's just the way soils are. We'll get a little bit more into why different soils behave differently. But one other thing I like to point out, which sort of, I probably don't have to point out to this group, but when I talk to some folks who don't work with soils or know much about soils, they kind of feel disconnected. You know, what do I have to do with soil? What does soil have to do with me? If you look at all of these functions, each one of those is something that provides a service for us, or that we utilize the soil for. Everything from where we get our water from, where we get our food from, where we treat our waste, where we support the buildings we live and work in, the roads that we drive on, and also to support us as part of the biota, you know, the biological organisms that function and interact with soils. So even a person who thinks they have nothing to do with soil, or soil that has nothing to do with them, we're all in touch with the soil every single day, whether you know it or not. So it's just kind of a nice thing to point out to everybody. So in my job, Tess mentioned about the first half of my career was mapping soils. So you can really go crazy evaluating a site and evaluating soil. When I did soil survey, one of the first things they gave me was a huge stack of these. It's called the USDA NRCS SOI 232 form. It's a pet-on description form. And if you look at the front of it, you don't have to remember any of this stuff. It's never going to come back to you. But look, if you look at all of the site information you can collect for one soil that you're looking at, including vegetative layer, parent material, all kinds of site information. You know, you can go crazy collecting site data. and then this is the back of the form, and there's 10 rows. That doesn't mean every soil has 10 horizons or layers, but these are some of the physical, chemical, and biological properties you can collect for one observation of the soil. And the interesting thing about this form, this is an official soil survey form for NRCS. This doesn't even have all of the possible properties you can collect for a soil, but just to show you how daunting describing and interpreting soils can be, at this level, I can actually identify a soil to a soil series and make all kinds of interpretations based on it. I would not do this in my normal job now, but this is sort of the apotheosis, or if you want to really go crazy and geek out on the soil, this is the form you would use. We also, as part of our work, as part of my job, we want to look at all kinds of things that could limit the soil. So this is a list, and it isn't even a full list. These are just physical, chemical, and maybe some biological properties of soils. We're not going to go through all of these, but just to give you a sense of like all the things you have to look at as far as soil limitations. And then we have one for site limitations, all kinds of things. You know, you really want to make sure, part of it is if you're using soils to grow crops, you want to increase your success rate. You want that crop to survive, but also you want to stay away from anything that could harm the crop or yourself, or if you're raising livestock, animals, anything that could be an impediment. We have to identify everything. So, they say soils are really complicated, and there's actually not that much known about soils for as long as people have been studying soils and civilizations have been using soils. There's still a lot to learn and a lot that we don't know. But these inventories are one way to learn a little bit more about the soil, or at least the site and how to use it more successfully. So one thing I try to do, knowing that soils are incredibly complicated, still try to find a few little things that could help you get a better sense for your soil and maybe identify some potential problems. So I didn't dumb anything down. These are sort of the core properties that I look at when I look at a soil too. So we're basically going to be doing the same thing. You don't even need to be a soil scientist to do this. So typically when we look at soils, we break it into three different sets of properties: physical properties, chemical properties, and biological. And these are basically the ones that we're going to go through right now. So the reason we look at some of these physical, chemical, and biological properties, they relate back to the functions of soils. They have an impact on them. They could be a reason why the soil can do something or why the soil cannot do something. And again, those could be not good or bad, but limitations that soil has that keeps it from performing every one of these functions. So it's an interpretation that a human being like me makes on a natural body like the soil to best determine its use and management. All right, so we're going to go into physical properties first. And the first thing we're going to look at is soil color. So there's two ways to think about soil color. One, it can tell you a little bit more about the soil, which could be kind of academic and soil geeky, or it could tell you something about how that soil is performing or what limitations it might have. So we're just going to look at some soil profiles. This is the Lordstown series. Soils have names. They usually get a name from where they were first established, discovered. This is up by me in Sussex County. It has kind of a light tan yellow color. And one thing that can tell you is that it might give you a sense of where that soil came from, what the initial material, the parent material had formed from. But one thing that this soil profile tells me is that this soil, having obtained its color from iron oxides that coat the soil particles, that the soil is very brightly colored, relatively speaking. It's not the brightest color on the planet, but this soil has oxygen in it. Just like rust on metal, the iron oxides are in an oxidized form. So the soil is oxidized. It has oxygen flowing through it. And that's just based on the soil color and nothing else. But also it inherited this color from the initial material, the parent material it formed from. This is a great photo, but this is a pen series. This is found more in Hunterdon and Somerset County. It formed from weathered bedrock that was it is a red shale. The red shale literally broke down over a really long time and broke down, weathered, and formed into a soil eventually. That soil inherited the colors of the red shale. So this kind of weird red purplish color of the soil, all the particles have that color from the initial red shale bedrock. All the rock fragments in the soil are red shale. So this soil is telling me it was formed from red shale, for one thing, there's no question about it, but also it's still a brightly colored soil, even though it's red, not yellow. So this soil also has a lot of oxygen in it. So just looking at the soil profile, looking at the color, we've already figured out a couple things about the soil. This one's a really interesting soil. It's basically an untouched, unretouched photo. So yes, the soil is that green. This is formed from a marine sediment called glauconite or green sand. This soil is telling me it's got a lot of glauconite in it. It basically formed from a deposit of this green sand glauconite. The glauconite implies other things about the soil, but so much that we can get into in a little bit more. But for now, we definitely know that this soil formed from something that was green that imparted that color. And kind of back up by me again, the Alden series. This soil is very pale looking. It's kind of grayish looking, or almost white in some places. This soil is the opposite of these other brightly colored soils. This soil is telling us that it's been saturated with water for a really long time. Most of the year, every single year, the iron actually transforms and undergoes a change, and the soil color starts to get more pale. It gets more gray. There could be little splotches of rust color, like an orange color in there, or sometimes the soil is just completely gray. And basically it's a response of the soil to being saturated with water for a prolonged period of time. So this would actually be a hydric soil, a wetland soil. And we would know that based on its morphology, on what it looks like. And then this is a really wet soil. It's called the Manahawkin series from down in the coastal plain of New Jersey. You can tell from the colors, the surface is organic material. It's technically called muck. It's a decomposed organic material, gives it that really black surface color. Underneath it are some marine sands that are also saturated with water, and they really don't have any color to them. So the colors here are telling us that there's a lot of organic matter in that upper part, and there's no oxygen in that lower part. And so even without touching the soil, without looking at it beyond a dug soil profile, we can already infer some things about the soil just based on the color. So remember, sometimes it's just tells you where the soil came from or what it's made of, but we can also interpret some things about the soil based on the soil color. And there's ways to describe it too. We can use what's called some sort of a color chart, color notation, such as Munsell. I think there's a couple other systems out there, but just now in general, brighter colors are oxidized, paler colors are anaerobic or unoxidized. So, all right, so that's color. So the other big physical property that we look at, that I look at every single time, once you get beyond the color, is soil texture. So if you can picture a soil sieve from a soil lab, it has like a mesh in the bottom of it. Looks like a cake pan. And you take a soil sample, you shake the sieve. Everything that falls through the 2 millimeter sieve is what we call the fine earth fraction. It starts at a little bit less than 2 millimeters. Everything that stays in the sieve is called a fragment. So anything that's retained, it could be a piece of glass or asphalt or rock or a piece of wood. Doesn't matter what it is. If it's larger than 2 millimeters, we call it a fragment. And we separate it out because the fragments behave differently in the soil versus these finer particles, which we call the fine earth fraction. They're subdivided into separate particle size separates: sand, silt, and clay. This is kind of a graphic to show you the relative size of sand. It's just way bigger than clay, which is microscopic. So if you go through each one, this basic range of less than 2 millimeters to 0.05 millimeters is sand. So sand is basically inert. They're the largest soil particles. They're kind of like really small rocks. They don't really have anything to do with the soil. They don't hold on to nutrients. They don't hold on to water. They take up some space. They can make a lot of space in the soil, pore space, which are like little pieces or areas within the soil that are not packed together with soil material. We'll talk a little bit more about pore space in a minute. But too much sand can make the soil droughty and infertile because it can't hold on to water, it can't hold on to nutrients, and when you touch it, it makes the soil feel gritty or rough. A little smaller than silt, almost down to 2 microns, is silt. It's also kind of inert. It doesn't really react with the soil. It doesn't hold on to water. It doesn't hold on to nutrients. Silt makes the soil feel soft and smooth. It's kind of a pleasant feel. But the problem, silt actually becomes buoyant in water because of its smaller size. It doesn't attach itself to water molecules, but if you mix it with water, it becomes buoyant and it stays in the water column for many, many hours. So unfortunately, if silt particles get picked up in surface water that's running over bare soil, it'll pick up the silt particles and carry it away. So it makes soils easy to erode. If you ever saw, milky colored, cloudy water running off of the site where there was bare soil, it's taking the silt with it. The sand particles are very large. They need a faster water to carry them away. The silt will get carried away in the surface run. The smallest particle is a clay particle. It is less than 2 microns. It's microscopic. It's so small, it looks like a little flat sheet or a plate. It has a net negative charge on the outside of it, which helps hold on to positively charged ions. That's a cation exchange capacity, or CEC. So clay particles can actually attract water molecules. The positive side of a water molecule, it can hold on to positively charged ions, cations, which a lot of times are nutrients. And so it can increase the fertility and water holding capacity of a soil. If there's too much clay, it holds on to water and nutrients too well and won't let them go. And it could actually make the soil infertile too, and also make the soil too tight and dense that won't let water move through it at all. Tactilely, the clay in a soil makes the soil feel sticky when it's moist or wet, or hard when dry. When I work with landowners and they talk about how their soil is like concrete, it's probably because there's a lot of clay in it, and when it dries out, it really does harden a lot, and it's very difficult to dig in. So clay can impart that property. So you take sandstone, clay. They occur in soils in different percentages, which change based on all kinds of factors, including the parent material or the initial material that the soil formed from. In a laboratory, you would do actually a particle size distribution analysis, PSDA, and actually figure out the percentage of sandstone, clay. You add them all together, they should add up to 100%. And what each percentage is, you plug it into a textural triangle. If you look at the triangle, you see there's no such thing as like 1% of sandstone clay that makes a loam. There's sort of a range. There's a range for clay. There's a range for silt loam, sand, loamy sand. So these different percentages make up these textural classes. These are actually called USDA soil texture classes, and they have an agricultural agronomic function. So when you say loam, you may picture one thing or think you feel one thing, but just know there's sort of a range of sandstone clay that fit into a textural class. So hopefully that makes sense. It's not easy to take soil samples from a site and take them back to your laboratory or send them out to a lab and get the particle size distribution analysis done, especially if you have a soil with like 6 or 7 horizons. So you need some sort of a field estimate. And the best field estimate is what they call a texture by field procedure. And this one is from the Soil Quality Test Kit, which came out in about 1999 or 2000. You can Google, or I should say, you can type into a search engine texture by field flow chart or texture by field procedure and find there's different universities make them. NRCS has a bunch of different ones. basically you key out the soil texture based on what it feels like. They basically start at the top. You have a little bit of soil material in your hand. You kind of wet it up a little bit. If it doesn't hold together at all, it's a sand. If it kind of holds together, but you can't really stretch it into a ribbon, then it's a loamy sand. And then when you go down to the bottom, you can make a ribbon, which is the graphic person pushing the soil over their pointer finger with their thumb. You try to make a ribbon, and based on how long the ribbon is, that gives a hint to how much clay is in the soil, and then you can actually fit it to a soil texture class. So as opposed to doing a laboratory method, you've got a field technique. And I've actually given variations of this to people who've never touched soil in their life, and they actually do pretty well. It's up to everybody's interpretation. I've done a lot of field work over the years. I have a lot of nerve damage in my hands, so I've lost some sensitivity. So I struggle with this sometimes, but basically, when you get down to the bottom, the length of the ribbon, and then you're feeling for the dominance of grittiness, which would be one of the sandy textures, smoothness, which would be one of the silt textures. And if it's neither gritty or smooth, then you end up at the bottom with a loam, a clay loam, or a clay. So it's a really neat technique. It really does work. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And it's a really handy way to figure out the soil texture, which is probably one of the most critical things to figure out. Depending on what crops you want to grow, if there's a texture requirement or a limitation, you want to know what that is, and this is the best way to do it. So we have the sand, silt, and clay. They get organized in different percentages to make soil texture classes, but all those particles also get aggregated together into what's called aggregates or PEDs that make up soil structure. Soil particles can get aggregated together by all kinds of things in the soil. Some of them are minerals, such as clay minerals, calcium ions, the iron oxides that coat the soil particles, or organic matter can be an input. It can actually glue. Organic matter particles can hold the soil particles, the mineral particles together, or byproducts of metabolism from microorganisms or decomposition of organic matter can work as a glue to hold soil particles together. So here we're going to zoom way in. These are two silt particles, and they're glued together a little bit by some clay particles and some organic. Holding them together, you picture millions and millions of these next to each other, networked together, and they form a structural unit. The structural units form over time due to soil forming processes that allow soil structure to develop. So there's different kinds of soil structure. You don't have to worry about the names. Just know that some of them are like granular, which are more spheroidal or spherical. We have some blocky type structures, subangular and angular blocky. Then we have more of a horizontal type of structure called platy. And then these larger aggregates or PEDs called prismatic. Some of the two on the right, prismatic and platy, are kind of fit tightly together, and platy is more of a horizontal structure. Doesn't really permit water and air and roots to move freely through the soil, versus granular and subangular and angular blocky. This isn't a product placement, but I learned this in college. Granular structure, which is really hard to make. It's actually made by continuous herbaceous cover, like grasses that are allowed to grow over time, and the soil's not disturbed. Get these little spherical balls that sort of like attached to the fine roots of grasses. And the best way to explain water movement through granular structure, one soils professor talked about a bowl of grape nuts. I think they still make grape nut cereal. If you take your milk and pour it into a bowl of grape nuts, the milk shoots right through past all of the little pieces, and I might actually like come up the sides of the bowl, fills and coats all of the grape nuts with milk almost immediately. That free movement of the milk is like free movement of air or water through granular structure. There's almost no impediment to movement, vertical movement of water and air exchange with the atmosphere, and lots of spaces for roots to penetrate and move around in. So we can zoom in to talk a little bit more about pore space. Here you have some granular PEDs. There's got a little Sherlock Holmes magnifying glass, and you can see the spaces in between that interaggregate pore. That is a space where water can flow down through, air can be exchanged up and down, and a root can penetrate in, attach itself to the soil, help anchor the soil, but also obtain nutrients and water, and just really anchor itself and have a stable base for the plant that's growing above them. So this is a kind of a neat photo you see. This isn't granular structure per se, but this is a really fine, small type of subangular blocky, or maybe even angular blocky. See how the roots that they dug the soil pit, they've exposed the topsoil. You see their roots are all interconnected. They're netted in, networked in. They're growing freely. There's no impediment to their growth, and that's what you want to see the topsoil layer. The small pore space, the small aggregates where there's lots of room to move around and obtain nutrients and water and allow that air to movement and allow the roots to really anchor themselves. So already kind of talked about this, but granular structure on the left readily allows that water to move vertically. And then if we have prismatic, has more of a tortuous path, it can fit down in between a crack between prisms, but it gets stopped. So has to find another crack. Subangular blocky is a little bit more vertical, and then platy is usually the toughest. So if you dig a soil pit and you see platy structure, which could be up near the surface due to compaction, you're going to get the same effect. That water's not going to move down, roots may be stopped by it, and it'll be an impediment to successful crop production. All right, so that's physical chemical properties. Now we have chemical soil properties, and there's a whole bunch of them that we could talk about, but the one outside of getting a soil test and testing your soil fertility and some of the other chemical properties that will help you understand a little bit more about the nutrient levels of your soil, the one that I look at a lot in the field is pH. In soil science, you call pH soil reaction. I don't know why, but that's what you call it. So it's just a term that we use. The normal pH scale is 0 to 14, and 7.0 is neutral. We have ranges. A lot of soil science criteria, characteristic parameters of ranges of things. We don't just have the one. We don't have the one measurement. So we fit into ranges. We actually have ultra acid and very strongly alkaline, and we let them go all the way to the ends of the pH scale because there are actually soils out there that have really high pHs and very, very low pHs. And just to know a little bit more about them is really important. And to be able to measure them in the field, if you can, gives you a sense of what's going on in that soil. Sometimes soil reactions, sometimes pH can actually be toxic to a plant directly. It can harm the plant tissues because it's too hostile an environment, too low a pH or too high a pH. And then there's usually a range of pHs or reactions that are best suited for particular crops. One reason that occurs is because different nutrients are available at different pH ranges. So you can, the most typical agronomic crop that I work with is corn. Corn wants a pH pretty specifically about 6.2. So when you test your soil, if it's somewhere above or below that, you have to work on the soil to bring that pH up or down. And that's where most of the nutrients that a corn plant needs, that is where their availability is highest or greatest for that particular crop. So if you have a soil with a low pH, you may have to bring the pH up to release some of these nutrients. If you have pH that's too high, you may actually have to acidulate the soil, add some kind of sulfur compound to bring the pH down. And another way to look at this, if you do soil testing and you find out what your pH ranges, what your soil reaction ranges are for that soil, or what the actual value is, coming into decision making of use and management of that soil, perhaps there's something you want to grow that you could grow that fits into the chemical properties of that soil the way it is. Maybe the pH is a little low. Maybe there's some sort of a crop or a plant, something you could establish where you wouldn't have to modify the chemistry of the soil, use it as is. That way the soil is already ready and available for you, Conversely, if you have a specific crop in mind, once you know the pH range that it likes to live in, the reaction range, you can then amend your soil, but to fit that parameter. So it's kind of like one or two ways. We've actually been on sites where someone's chemistry of their soil is very unusual, and they can end up growing some kind of specialty crop that maybe someone else can't, because they can't make their soil have that sort of chemistry, but that soil has it naturally. So, nothing wrong with being a little flexible and creative with this too. And the closer that soil is to being agreeable to your particular use, the fewer inputs you have to put into it to get it to perform for you. But this is all about success too. Want to make sure your project or your crop is successful. So that's why we need to look at these things along with soil fertility. All right, so nutrient levels and availability, there's some things that influence them. A lot of it has to do with the type of soil, because soils can have their own chemistry naturally, even without any influence upon them. And then the big thing is past land use or management. If a site was traditionally cropped agronomic crops, that pH could be at 6.2. If you want to grow something with that requires a lower pH, the soil reaction will have to be brought down, but we have to know what that is first. So if you have a sense of what the soil was used for before, what the land was used for before, it gives you a better idea of what we might need to do to adjust that soil. And then, of course, you can determine some things in the field, but of course, laboratory results are a lot more accurate and consistent. So, all right. So the last part of the properties of the biological soil properties, I'm not even going to pretend to be an expert on the biological components of soil. Just have a few little things that help with understanding what's going on with this component of soil, these properties. The biggest contributor is soil organic matter, we call SOM, or organic matter. It's the fraction of the soil where it's derived from anything that once lived. It can be plant or animal residues, remains. It can be exudates. It can be byproducts of metabolism from substances emanating from plant roots or soil microbes. So there could be a living component or a decomposition component. Lots of different sources. The one kind of overriding thing is that we say, for the most part, you don't really want more than about 5% soil organic matter. It probably doesn't sound like a lot, but considering most of it's going to be concentrated up near the surface in the topsoil layer, the upper part of the soil that you're going to be interacting with, you want that organic matter to be at a level that's agreeable and usable for the soil, but you don't want an excess of it. I've actually seen sites where too much organic matter has been added to a site, and it actually can destabilize the soil. The soil organic matter has no bearing strength, so you can't traffic over it. You can't navigate through it, and it can actually make plants unstable, because it doesn't have that denseness, that the rigidity that mineral soil particles have. So a little bit of organic matter is good, but you definitely don't want to overdo it. So this is our theoretical. In any soil, you want maybe about half of it to be pore space, or those open spaces, half of it to be solid mineral material, and then you add that 5% organic matter. In a really ideal world, half the pore space would be filled with water and half would be filled with air. We know that probably can't happen a lot, but that's when we think everything's working at its optimum in the soil. So all kinds of relationships of soil organic matter to the soil ecology or the biological systems in a soil. It's an energy source. It also helps hold on to carbon and retain it. And then it can, for any soil texture, if there's sort of a lack of organic matter, adding organic matter can improve the soil's performance. Sandy soil is droughty and infertile. Organic matter added can help with water holding capacity and fertility, nutrient holding capacity of that soil. A silty soil that has that overabundance of silt that could be easily eroded. The organic matter can sort of help hold those silt particles together and maybe lessen the chances of erosion. And clayey soil that's really hard when it's dry, hard to work, maybe holds itself together a little too well. If you can incorporate some organic matter, it gets in between those clay particles, or helps make some space, some pore space, keeps some areas open, and lightens up that soil a little bit. So organic matter applied correctly and appropriately can really improve the performance of any mineral soil. So all kinds of sources of organic matter. You can get it from photosynthesis from the plants, and then also from all of those organic sources, decomposition, metabolism. And I kind of already mentioned this, but soil texture could play a factor in how much organic matter is really the most agreeable for your soil. Looks like finer textured soils like silt loams, you can add a little bit more, probably needs that amount to get in between all those small particles. Loamy sand, which has more sand than silt or clay in it, has bigger pore space. Those organic particles can get in between much more readily. You may not need as much organic matter added to increase the performance of that soil. So there is sort of a texture relationship there too. And the other part, which I've already sort of alluded to, is this soil food web. This is sort of a soil health, soil quality concept. And, it's everything from bacteria to organic matter, the plant root systems, different trophic levels, different size animals, and they all perform different functions. Some of them interact directly with plants. Some of them help to decompose organic matter, break it down. Some of them consume it, and based on their metabolism, they exude some beneficial compounds. And then let's face it, it's a food chain. So some parts of the food web are food sources for other parts of the food web as you work your way up through the trophic levels. But just like any other web, you take a piece away, it destabilizes the web and it starts to collapse. And also, if you have an overabundance or a dominance of any part of the web, it throws everything sort of out of balance, out of equilibrium. So, different soil settings, different ecosystems are going to have variations of the food web, but there's going to be different players, and they all need to work together to keep everything sort of in equilibrium, keep everything working. So, all right, so those are all the soil properties that we would look at: physical, chemical, biological. We can find out a lot about the performance of the soil and any potential issues based on that. But we also have some site features, which I'd like to go really, really quick, just to give you a sense, because that soil is located on a site. And sometimes the soil can be okay, but the site may have some limitations. So, well, the two most common things I look at are the aspect of a slope and the gradient of a slope. The aspect is the direction, the compass direction that a slope faces. So the easiest way to figure that out is to stand on a slope and point your toes down slope. So once they're pointed directly down slope, whatever compass direction your toes are pointing, that's the aspect. That's the direction that the slope faces. It's not so much an issue in New Jersey, but places where there's a lot of topography, a lot of elevation, you can actually get shading or shadowing and microclimates based on compass direction. You see a little bit of it in New Jersey in some very steep areas where a north-facing slope could be cooler and wetter, and a southern-facing slope could be warmer and drier. The south-facing slope gets more direct sunlight, and the north-facing slope is a little bit more shaded and turned away from the sun here in the northern hemisphere. So aspect can be an issue, not always a problem, but something to think about. Slope gradient is something I look at all the time. It could be an issue if it's too level an area and too flat. That could allow water to pond or pool. And the biggest issue is when the slope gets too steep. It could be some crops may not like to grow on slopes, or it could be a management issue if the slope gets too steep. You may be uncomfortable walking on that. It may be difficult to walk on a steep slope it may be impossible to use equipment, tractors, vehicles, um, animals grazing, so slope is a consideration. Slope is just basically the change in elevation or over a change in distance. The easiest way to think of it, if you set a stake in the ground and walked 100 feet away from it and looked back at it, if there was any difference in the elevation of the 2 points within on either side of the 100 feet, that change in elevation is the slope. So if you walked 100 feet from a point and looked back and it was 6 feet higher or lower than where you just were, that's 6 feet of elevation change in 100 feet, and it's a 6% slope. So that's basically how it works. There's all kinds of devices to measure slope to get a little bit better sense of what that's all about. So along with slope itself is the shape of a slope or the complexity. So you don't have to remember any of this stuff, but just know that some sites have a lot of changes to the slope. It's not just one type of slope. There are names to slopes. If you ever want to have a conversation or describe your site, and this changes radically in relation to water movement in the soil and the soil characteristics themselves. Some places, the summit and the shoulder are the driest parts of a site. Some places, there are actually wetlands on summits, and those are the wettest sites. Sometimes foot slopes and toe slopes are areas where water actually emanates from the ground as seeps, and those could be the wettest parts of a landform. So kind of depending on the soils and depending on the disposition of your landform, it could be a consideration where you want to plant something. If water is an issue, either too much or not enough, you may have to study your site a little bit. So almost more critical than the position of a landform is the slope shape. And this looks kind of crazy, but basically the two arrows are showing water flow down a slope. So where the arrows point away from each other are areas where water diverges, and that location on that slope could be a little bit drier than everything else around it. Where the arrows point towards each other, that's more of a concave landform. Water collects and concentrates. So sometimes you want a site that has a little bit more water in a particular spot. Sometimes you want to make sure there's no water in that particular spot. So anywhere you see concavity to a site, just know, at least theoretically, there's better chance for water to be collected either as surface runoff or water flowing through the soil. So, example of an upland area, and we have not that good with plants, but these trees are well anchored. I know the soil here is very deep and no limitations. It's a nice stand of, I think they're pine trees, and no real impediments to growing anything here. You probably could grow the crops here. It's high and dry, so no water issues here. If you go down to a foot slope position, suddenly the tree roots are sitting on top of the ground. I actually see little water spots. I see some little tufts, those dark green tufts are some hydrophytic vegetation that like living in wetlands. So you're seeing some surface water emanating from the ground, and you're seeing morphologic adaptation of the trees to water at or maybe even above the soil surface. So you see this depending on and if it's the landform position where water is being promoted to collect, this might be an area you might want to stay away from if you want your crop to be in a drier soil. And then of course, something like this is a vernal pool. It's actually a little study site of mine, and a circle surrounded by soils that actually are still kind of wet. They're allowing water to flow down to this area and collect. So even though the wet spot there where the water is obviously wet, you may go up the slope quite a ways and the soil is actually still wet. So it's a combination of the landform position and the soils themselves. So talking about water, this is maybe not the best graphic on the planet, but I don't know, something charming about it. It's from the Soil Conservation Service, from what previously was NRCS. So there's two kinds of water tables in a soil. There's an apparent or a regional water table that comes from lower in the ground, and these could be considered almost aquifers. They're very large collections of water. And then you have perched water tables, where water gets held on top of some sort of impervious layer or horizon within the soil. So they function completely different. A regional water table or a parent, very large area, lots of water in that system. Perched is more surface driven, where water collects at or near the surface and is conducted through the soil at shallower depths. So unlike the apparent or regional water table, you have a restrictive layer. That water will enter the soil, which is infiltration. It'll percolate through the soil profile, which is called percolation. It'll hit the top of a restrictive layer. If there's a slope component to it, the water will flow laterally down to a low-lying area. So here's that foot slope, toe slope. It could create enough wetness conditions to support a pond, a surface water body, or a wetland. And the interesting thing is that the water is all up near the surface. If you dig down deep enough, you get into the restrictive layer, the soil is actually dry. There will not be any water down there, despite how wet the soil is at or near the soil surface. So kind of just interesting systems. If this was a regional water table, you would dig down, it would be a restrictive layer. You just keep digging down into permeable material, and the water would be there coming up from below, but emanating and displaying at the ground surface or above. So the perched water table is just a unique system, but there's a lot of them throughout the state. And we talked about this before, but water tables saturate the soil. They create a transformation of iron in the soil, and they make the soil look gray. So going back to that color component as a physical property, we can see where water tables occur in soils based on this graying up of the soils. So on the left, the Chippewa series, there actually is a restrictive horizon at 32 inches, and it starts to get brightly colored. You see it's gray on top. The Alden series has a regional water table. It looks like it's getting red at the bottom, but that's kind of like fall. The soil is actually gray from the top to the bottom, even down where the word Alden is technically speaking. So regional water table in the Alden, perched water table in the Chippewa. So the Chippewa series has what's called a fragipan, which is a restrictive horizon. And here you can see another version of it. There's that gray zone from about 80 centimeters to 110 centimeters. That's a perched water table. And underneath it, it gets more brightly colored. That's the fragipan. It's a restrictive horizon. It's perching the water on top of it. You can see in this soil, the gray doesn't go all the way up to the surface. So that water table is sort of down below. So you might actually still have some arable, usable soil on top of that. But this could be a limitation. Tree or plant roots that can get down further into the soil will not interact with that water table zone, and they will stop on top of it. If that water table gets closer to the ground surface, it could actually drown out your plants, and your plants will acknowledge it as a restrictive horizon. So another common restrict site feature is bedrock, and on the ground surface, it's called a rock outcrop, where it sticks out. In the soil, it's called bedrock. So this is the Arnott series, and you can see he's only 17 inches deep, and that's hard. That's from Kittatinny Mountain. That is hard conglomerate bedrock from the Schoenagel formation, and you only have 17 inches of soil. And this is where soil conservation gets really critical, because if you lose even a couple inches of that soil, you now don't have 17 inches of soil, you have 15 inches of soil. And the more soil you lose, eventually you'll end up with just bedrock, because that soil will have gone, and the circumstances that created that soil will never come back in our lifetime. So it would be impossible to make more of this soil. This is all the soil you get in this particular location. So all soils are critical to protect, especially these soils that don't have a lot to start with. And then rock outcrop is a severe limitation, because it's a non-soil area. I know it's kind of funny, mature trees are growing out of this rock outcrop, but it's not a soil area. Very challenging to use, very challenging to realize. Another limitation of the soil that doesn't really seem that easy to understand is a high rock fragment content. You get enough rock fragments into a soil, especially large ones, the plant roots do not acknowledge that as living soil material either. These are the fragments. These are all greater than 2 millimeters in size. They actually become an impediment to the root growth, and they can kind of help make the soil a little too droughty and infertile by increasing their permeability, but they really can be a limitation as far as plant growth, effective root depth of the soil, and also just think about hand digging if you're planting plants by hand or tilling. Some of these large rock tracts could really be challenging to work with. So it's another limitation that we acknowledge in a soil. And I mentioned glauconite, that was that green soil, the Marlton series, and you don't have to read all of this. It's a fascinating, naturally occurring marine sediment in southern New Jersey. It's a green colored sand. It's made of sand-sized pellets that are aggregations of clay minerals. So it kind of acts like a sand if it's in the sand form, but if it's smeared or compacted or weathers down, it breaks down. The sand breaks down to clay, and the clay has a very unusual behavior, and it's really good at holding onto water and making surface wetness issues. So you have to be really careful when you work with glauconite. You don't want to smear or compact it or disturb it too much. And here's our Marlton soil again. And yeah, they're very challenging soils to work with. The clay in these soils is actually called a high activity clay. So when it takes on water, it swells. And when it dries out, it contracts. And when it's contracted and dried, water can move readily through the soil. But when it swells up with water, it actually seals itself to the ground surface and could actually make a water body on top of it and completely seals itself off and becomes unusable. So it's a very challenging soil to work with. So just to sum up, the only way to look at your soil is to get out there. This is probably shockingly about a third of all the hand tools I have in my literal toolbox in my work truck. If you ever saw my white Ford pickup, I have a toolbox in the back, and some of these shovels look redundant, but each one of them has its own unique function. They all kind of weigh different and they feel different, and I use them for different purposes. If you want to dig deeper, you can get yourselves an auger. I have kind of like an oversized auger for my work with a bunch of extensions. I think I can go 15 feet with my hand auger, which I actually had to do once. It's not something I recommend, but to get a deeper look, that auger is 60 inches tall, so I can get pretty far down in the ground. Really need to take a good look at the soil when I'm out there. But it all starts with digging a hole. Don't be afraid. It can be daunting. If you have access to hydraulic machinery, always be safe. Dig down to a reasonable depth. Try to minimize your disturbance, but always be safe, especially getting into a soil pit. And then for my own work, I actually have a soil coring machine, which was bought for me a couple of years ago. It's called a GeoProbe, and it punches a 4-foot soil core sampler into the ground, and it's retained inside a little PVC liner. And what's nice is I can punch holes. I can actually go 24 feet with this, and it makes a 2.5-inch diameter hole, so it kind of minimizes disturbance. Has kind of a light touch, but I can really get a good look at that soil. And I'm a soil geek, and for me, I can never look deep enough. You can never know enough about the soil. But even just get down to the surface, get some equipment that you're comfortable working with that won't hurt you, and don't be afraid to dig a hole. Don't be afraid to explore. And just remember, soil. Again, it's very complicated. There's a lot of components to the soil. There's a lot of things that the soil interacts with. And it's all about making sure we understand as much as possible about our site and our soil to achieve successful results. And I always like to end with a quote. And I always kind of like this one from Henry David Thoreau. So actually kind of struck me. I don't think I think of the biological component of myself either very much. So always good to keep that in mind. But that's all I have. That's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Fred. I love this quote. It really, we're all connected, right? We're all partly soil.
There's sort of a joke to Henry David Thoreau. I had a volunteer who I worked with, and she nicknamed me Henry David Thoreau, and I never knew why. I didn't know that much about him, and she said I was very long-winded, which you might have found out tonight, and she said, she always said about Henry David Thoreau, why use 40 words when you can use 700? But she actually meant it as a compliment. But I started reading David, some of his stuff, and I came upon this. I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. So, but anyway.
That's so great. Awesome. Well, I just kind of gave everybody the ability to unmute yourself if you do have a question you want to jump in verbally. Anybody feel free to do that. If not, drop them in the chat if you have any. I am like reeling a little bit. I love there's so much with soil. It's amazing.
Yeah, I was afraid I might have fit too much in there, but you know,
no. That was great. It's
yeah,
like
well, I appreciate
it's amazing how like like what you just said, you can never go deep enough. There's just like so much we don't know about what's going on underneath our feet and underneath everything.
Yeah,
It's like really incredible.
yeah. I mean, that's the thing, and not to scare people, but in my own work, we have like a minimum depth of observation. So usually based on the conservation practice that they're implementing or crop they're growing, we at least look down to the rooting depth of that crop. But it's always good to look a little bit below that if you can. And then you just end up digging deeper because, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, you can't know enough. You don't want something to surprise you.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, just for like my own curiosity out of to kind of close out here,
Yes.
I have two kind of random questions.
Okay.
What's your favorite thing about soils and your favorite thing about your job and what you get to do?
I think the favorite thing about my job, and I didn't discover this, the first half of my career, I was a mapping soil scientist. So I didn't really work with people. It was, talk about it was almost like a giant research project. It didn't have, it had a purpose to create a soil survey or updates to soil surveys, but it was for its own use. It didn't really serve a purpose. So I think one of my favorite things about my job is sort of two parts. One is it sounds kind of corny, but like helping people diagnose problems. I hate to see people struggle, and if there's any way possible I could figure out how to help them diagnose a problem, a plant establishment or growth issue or a surface wetness problem, to help them figure something out. Trying to study a naturally occurring thing that is very difficult to understand, it makes me feel good. Like I really work hard at that, and try not to take it too seriously, but I do, like, I have some sleepless nights if I don't understand something. I do a lot of research. I read journal articles and things. I'm constantly learning, constantly. And the other thing that's kind of funny is that for as much as you think for as much as you've seen, soils are very humbling because you never become an expert. Like, you think you've seen something a million times, and then you find that one time when the soil is just doing something you didn't expect, or you see something you've never seen before. And it's daunting because you still have to do your job. You still have to interpret it and help people. But there's like an excitement to it, but there's also a fear that, like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm looking at. But I kind of like that, if it was boring and mundane, it's like, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. That's great too. But I like the challenge. It's like my coworkers joke with me because sometimes if I'm staring at something and I have no idea what it is, they just notice I'm quiet for a while, and then they're sort of like, you okay, Fred? And I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. But you're like, but that's okay, because we're going to figure it out. They understand that soil is a unique thing. It doesn't get stamped out from a factory. It's out there. It's been out there before we were here, and it'll be there after we're gone. And I like the challenge. I like being humbled. I like having it say, you have no idea what I'm about, do you? And I'm like, well, I'm going to figure it out, maybe. So,
Awesome.
but yeah, and I think that what I love about my job is I cover the whole state for New Jersey. I cover 6 NRCS field offices, and I do field work, either soils investigations or my own studying in almost every county. Over these last like 15 years, I've been a resource soil scientist, and I just love this state. I grew up in Pennsylvania, so to come work in New Jersey and then to literally be able to like study almost every part of it, I get to see sandy soils and the outer coastal plain and these weird glauconitic soils, the green sands. I get to see stuff up in the mountains and the red shale soils and human transported soils, anthropogenics, man-made soils, and every variation of every kind with different kinds of land uses. And you just can't get bored. There's no such thing as a boring soil to me. And some days I'm driving to South Jersey, I have no idea what I'm going to look at, and that's kind of cool. Like I don't know what today's going to bring.
For sure.
Yeah,
New Jersey's such a small state, but we have so much variety going on in the landscape and everything. And it feels
it's
like soil is
amazing.
like this one big mystery, or you're like interpreting a different language for people, like just all of the
Yeah.
different layers and everything. It's really cool.
Yeah, I actually do one of my presentations I do for a lot of colleges. It's basically the soils of New Jersey. I just go through, I break New Jersey up into some different sections, and I just talk about kind of like the dominant soils throughout the state. And I kind of never get tired of I've done that presentation like a million times, and I never get tired of doing that because it just sort of reminds, like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, this place is nuts. It's not, it's never not interesting. Bad grammar, but it's like, yeah.
Heck yeah, that's awesome. Um, to close us out, what's like one takeaway of like one thing you wish everybody knew about soil in general, or just, or a reminder of like, I don't know.
It's yeah, like a reminder or advice is, would be, I don't, I'm not judging anybody in the room here, but people I've worked with, there does seem to be an intimidation factor to soils because they are very strange. It's kind of funny. We used to joke they're right below our feet, but we never look into them. We never study them. And don't get wrapped up in the terminology and all the jargon and stuff. Dig a soil pit just to experience the idea of it. You're gonna look at the place where your crop is going to grow or your project is going to go in, and you don't need to have all of this stuff that it's good to learn the terminology because it's the standard language of soil science. But I was there too. Before, I've been working with soils for a really long time, even before NRCS. But until I started to learn things, I didn't know anything. And I was there too, looking at a soil pit, having no idea what I was looking at, and I think the big thing would just be, don't be afraid. It's like I think sometimes it holds people back. I took a college student out to the field once, and I gave him a shovel and an auger, and they're like, "What are we gonna do?" I'm like, "We're gonna walk out in the woods and dig a hole." And she was like, "You're out of your mind, really?" And we dug a soil pit. We did a full description, that wretched 232 form. We filled the entire thing out. We filled the soil pit back in, and we're walking back to my government truck. And she was funny. She was like, "I can't believe we just did that." She's like, "That's insane." She's like, "Why would a human being purposely do something like that?" And I'm like, well, it was a mystery, and now it's not. Now we know a little bit more about what's going on out there. And I said, that's all it is. And you don't need to have all the background and the education and everything. There's something you can learn, something you can know. And if you don't know, that's why you keep digging. You keep digging until you know more, and just don't, if is any of that fear or anxiety, like, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not smart enough, or I can't figure this out. Like that's not an issue. The fact that you're digging the soil pit, you're already learning something, you're teaching yourself something. You're going into a world that some people are afraid to go into. Even my coworkers are afraid. That's why they have me do soils investigations, because they don't want to look. They're afraid they'll be judged. I'm so stupid, I don't know what this is. No, that's not it at all. So just that, allow yourself to be intimidated and afraid and to not understand, let that all go. And then once you get past that, then you start tearing it apart and playing with it and texturing it and having fun and learning. It's like, I don't know, I always feel like there's something that holds people back. And I try really, really hard, especially in field activities, to like get people past that, because I was there too. I still remember what it's like. So just don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to explore. It's not that big of a deal. It's not life or death here.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's life and death.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in the observation, right? There's like, you can learn so much just by observing. But
for all that I've been taught in my soils classes, a lot of that didn't gel until I went into the field. I remember there was a concept that I was explained to in a soil genesis class, where soils come from, and the whole time I had no idea what it was. I started working for NRCS, 5 or 6 years later, and I'm out in the field, and someone points out, they say the term, they're like, that's what this is. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like all those years they were telling me what this was. Like, I had no idea. They didn't explain it. They didn't have a picture of it. I had no idea. And now I see it all the time, and it's not that big of a deal. But that's one thing that made soil science intimidating to me. Like there's so much to know. And it's not like a soil, when you dig a soil pit, it doesn't tell you anything about itself. It doesn't go, oh, I'm the Arnott series and I have this and that going on with me. You dig a soil pit, you have no idea. Even if you look at the soil mapping, it could be an inclusion, it could be a weird soil, and you have no idea what it actually is. So so some of it is using what you've learned, but some of it is putting all of that aside and just objectively looking at it. I knew soil scientists who actually would draw pictures. They would sketch the soil pit that they were describing, including taking the picture, but they did it almost as a activity, as an exercise to like reinforce it in their mind. I always thought that was really cool. Someone actually had colored pencils and everything. They would draw the soil they were describing on the description form. And I actually thought that was a really cool thing. If I was artistic, I would love to do that. But whatever, it's like whatever it takes, don't.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's but that's why field exercises, field experiences would be really beneficial too. It's not, for us.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to get you back out on the sage farm for another in-field workshop.
Yeah.
But this was great. Thanks to y'all for hanging on to the last bit with us. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to ask them now. Or like Fred said, he serves the whole state, so I'm sure he would be into fielding questions or anything if anybody has anything that they want to follow.
If you want, if anybody has a question, they can send it to Tess, and then Tess can send them to me. We can handle it that way. So perfect. Anybody who's got an interest in learning, I certainly encourage that. So, yeah,
absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Fred, and thanks everybody for hanging on with us, and this is great. So I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Tess. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Take care.